Today's topic was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a term that all middle schoolers should be familiar with as we talk about the Buddha and his quest for enlightenment in sixth grade. What we mean, though, when we say the Enlightenment in seventh grade social studies is very different, and today we're going to talk about just what the Enlightenment was. Now, please remember, Europe was dominated by absolute monarchies. When the Enlightenment begins, the absolute monarchies, they were at their heights. It was the time period when almost every country in the world had an absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy, and monarchy means king or queen. Absolute, once again, means a group, absolute power, total power, no limits to the power of the king or queen. The world was dominated by this system at this time. Got a cartoon from the comic strips, which guy gets introduced as the new press secretary for the king in The Wizard of Id. And he makes the mistake of speaking his mind and saying what he thinks about the king, comments on the fact that the king's really short. Now, in today's America, this would not be a problem because you can speak your mind, you can say what you think about somebody. But historically, this wasn't always the case, and so when the press secretary makes a comment about the king being short, the press secretary finds himself locked up for the rest of his life. Now, today's government, real life, he would probably wind up dead, but for the cartoon and for the comic strip, they just had him thrown in jail. The major thing behind the idea of an absolute monarchy was the concept of a divine right. Kings claimed that they were chosen by God to be king. We talked about this a few weeks ago. And because they were chosen by God to be king, then you couldn't question the king without questioning God. And nobody wanted to question God. God is all-powerful, people generally believe, and so if you question God, then you're courting disaster, you're asking for trouble. And people didn't want to do that. People didn't have many rights. And then yesterday we talked about the fact that scientists began questioning the church. Scientists questioned the church and they managed to win. They got the right to question the church. Well, if scientists could question the church, which was definitely God's representatives on earth, then why couldn't people question the king, who was just in charge of one country? And so during the Enlightenment, this becomes a major concern, the fact that you can question your king or your queen. Now that we've established the background information, we need to look at what a philosophy really is. The Enlightenment is an example of a philosophy, so we need to understand what philosophies are. A philosophy is a system of how you live your life, a way to live your life. There are few subjects in the world I find as interesting as religions and philosophies. Religions are specific philosophies which deal with God, and deal with your relationship to a God or a higher power. Philosophies teach how we live our lives. Everybody eventually asks, why are we here? What are we supposed to do? And a philosophy answers that question. A philosopher is a teacher of a philosophy, someone who expounds the idea behind the philosophy. I've got three famous philosophers on the screen that we talk about in sixth grade. There's Socrates, comes up with the philosophies in Greece, and begins the idea of teaching by questioning. There's Confucius from China, who came up with 5 key principles to living your life, like having faith of something, working hard, and respecting things. And finally, I've got the Buddha, who's India's most famous philosopher, who taught how to find enlightenment or peace in living in harmony with nature and in living in harmony with your neighbors and things of that sort. Now that the final piece of the puzzle to today's notes has been established, absolute monarchs, philosophies, philosophers, we need to talk about specifically what the Enlightenment is. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement during the 17th and 18th century, which sought to apply reason to society and thereby better understand and improve society. That's the book definition. It's the perfect definition. And it's great as long as everybody understands those words. But I'll be honest, as someone who's taught this class for years and someone who studied this concept for years, that's a crazy definition. So we need to break it down. Intellectual means your brain, your intellect. So the Enlightenment's a thinking man's movement, a smart person's movement. It's a group of smart people coming together. The 17th and 18th centuries, in which they got together and they began to reason. Now, the word reason can mean several things, but in this case it means to think things through. So a bunch of smart guys get together to start thinking things through in an attempt to better understand society. And society, as a reminder, is us, the people, the culture, the group. So the Enlightenment's a group of smart guys getting together to talk about ways to make our group life better. Specifically, it's going to deal with governments. So how would an Enlightenment era philosopher react to the idea of divine right and absolute monarchs? Enlightenment era political philosophers began to challenge the idea of divine right. Whether you believe in God or not, when you get down to it, most people become king or queen because their families were already the kings and queens, the monarchs. So it's more a matter of birthright than divine right. It's more of a matter of you're just a lucky person to be born to that family than the fact that God chose you to be in charge. And when political philosophers began questioning the idea of divine right, then there was no reason not to question kings in the first place. If the main reason people listened to the kings and did what the king said was because they were afraid that God would punish them if they didn't, when that notion got tossed out, then suddenly everybody could question the king and begin to think for themselves. And this helped lead to the development of limited government, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Got a picture of the Statue of Liberty in the top right-hand corner? That's because our government is based on this principle that government's not chosen by God, and it's limited. The idea of the social contract is really important to understand, and it's an Enlightenment answer. They've got rid of the absolute monarchs. They've begun to question that whole concept. If government's power doesn't come from God, then where does government's power come from? And the enlightened answer, the answer from these smart guys, is the concept of the social contract. Social contract is an agreement, because that's what a contract is. A contract's just a big fancy word for an agreement. Whether you're talking about a cell phone contract and you agreeing to pay a bill and them agreeing to give you service, whether you're talking about a music contract, some guy agrees to sing for a recording label and some recording label agrees to pay him money and make money off of him. Social contract is a contract between the government, the guys in charge of the country, and the people that are governed. It's an agreement between the United States and you living in Chester or wherever you live in. The United States government agrees to keep us safe from invasion by a foreign country. The United States government agrees to provide certain things that we need to live day to day. And in turn, we agree not to go running around and killing each other. We agree to be good citizens. We agree to pay our taxes. We agree to hopefully go and vote. The social contract is that agreement between the government and, like Thomas Jefferson will say, those governed. In 6th grade, we got to talk about a lot of religious philosophies. In 7th grade, we won't talk about many at all. It is important, though, to understand the religious component of the Enlightenment, because these guys, they did have a religious desire to understand things. The Enlightenment's the group of smart guys getting together and talking about ways to improve society. Well, that includes a look at religion. These guys were in a Christian culture. They were bombarded by the belief that God was very much a real part of life. And yesterday when we talked about Stephen Hawking, we discussed the fact that today scientists often say there is no God or there's no need for God. But during this time period, people believed very much that God was an essential part of where the universe came from. The religious side of the Enlightenment is called deism. It says that yes, God made the universe, because otherwise where did we get here from? But they believe that God has basically been on vacation ever since. That's why bad things happen. Obviously bad things happen, we all know this. And they would say it's because God's just not hanging around. Yes, he made us, but now he's doing something else. They used to use the example of a watchmaker. He makes the watch and then it just does its thing. And so I've got a picture here of a watchmaker. Now, in conclusion, you need to understand that all Enlightenment philosophers, they agreed that absolute monarchies were a tremendous threat to people. Absolute monarchies were a big threat to regular people. They could do whatever they wanted, and people could not question them. However, they do not all agree on how to solve the problem of unlimited governments or absolute monarchies. Yes, they all think they need to be changed, and yes, they all think it needs to be done away with. But how do you do away with it? How do you change things? That's going to be the key component. So for the next few days, we're going to talk about 4 big philosophers that South Carolina says y'all need to know. These 4 philosophers come up with their own ways around the unlimited government situation. Be prepared to discuss these guys starting tomorrow.